So proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting
We're honored today to have a gentleman from the Western Pennsylvania Audubon Society who's going to talk to us all about birds. He was a former history professor at Robert Morris University. He's the education director at the Western Pennsylvania Audubon Society. So he's going to talk to us about some of our local birds here and some of the threats to them, declining bird populations. So I'm going to let him give you a master class on birds. Chris Kubiak.
Thank you, Mark. Well, thank you very much, and you can hopefully all hear me. I like to joke I'm a loudmouth. That's why I got into history and talking about birds, so hopefully this is an overload. But thank you for having me here today. It's nice being actually back very close to where I grew up. My parents still live in Franklin Park, and I actually birded a lot down in this area. And yes, we use that as a verb, by the way. So, and it's also nice to see Glenn Davis. I'm going to embarrass him here for a quick second. He was one of my first students in Audubon's Master Birder program back, I think it was 2016, Glenn? The years all start to blend together after a while. So, yeah, as Mark mentioned, I don't have an academic training in birds or ornithology or anything in the biological sciences. I like to joke I would have loved to do that, but I'm terrible at math, so I got into history. So that's why I'm a historian. But long story short, I taught at Robert Morris, I taught at CCAC as an adjunct, and I went to Audubon because academia is getting a little bit challenging, and it was the best decision I ever made. Birds are something that if you would have even told me 15 years ago that I'd be sitting here today talking to you about, I'd be going, are you kidding me, right? This was always a hobby of mine, and I've got a lot of different types of hobbies. But birds have a very strong connection with history, right? I use this historical analogy, right? In fact, my family members came to Pittsburgh from Poland to be steel workers. A number of them were also coal miners, right? And you're probably familiar, I would think, some of you are familiar with that term, the canary in the coal mine, right? Yeah. Back in the olden days. My relatives, I heard this story a bazillion times, you know how they, expound upon it, that they would have canaries and all sorts of other things, but when they'd go in those mines, that was your early warning if there was something wrong. So this is before modern technology that could show that there was pockets of methane gas, right? Even if you're not a bird nerd, as I call myself, right? In fact, I was bird nerding on the way down here. Birds are telling us that there is something wrong in our environment, just like those canaries in the coal mine, because when we see declining bird species, that says that the whole ecosystems that these birds are living in and interacting are the same ones that we are living in and interacting, right? And I'm going to tell you some stuff that's very sobering that at times does keep me awake at night when I think about it. But I will tell you, and this is what you hear a lot of times in the environmental movement or people that pay attention to this stuff, that we're too doom and gloom. And I agree with that, because we've faced challenges just as bad, if not worse, in the past, right? How many of you are familiar with our bald eagle camera down in Hayes, down on the south side? That's actually where my Polish side of my family's from. They worked in those mines. I was part of the installation of those cameras. And it was really cool, this full circle coming back to where my family worked in those mills, right? And there's a story in my family how my grandfather would say his dad, my great-grandfather, told him, if you do one thing, I will beat you, and that is swim in the Mon River. That's the best way to get sick and pretty much, go to the hospital. That was a polluted river. Even to the 1950s, there was 0 fish, including carp, living in there. Now think about this. Less than 100 years later, we have a thriving bald eagle nest that has never once lost a young, which is very unusual with bald eagles. It's because that river is so clean today. So I think there's these neat things. So as we talk about these various challenges that we face, and the canary is teetering right now, we can overcome those, right? So let's just talk about some of these challenges here. There's a lot of stuff here. If I like to reference real data, right? This is not just opinions. There's evidence-based information out there if you really want to dive into it. Every year we have, it's called the State of Birds, and they're showing that a lot of species that you may even be familiar with, like robins and catbirds, in some parts of the country are in decline, right? Even birds that are non-native, like our wild feral pigeons or the English house sparrow, they are in decline, okay? And so there seems to be a very common sort of declining trend of a substantial amount of species. Some more what we would consider niche species that have real specific niches in the environment that they focus and live and interact with, they're the ones that we are severely concerned about. And you'll see up here, rufous hummingbirds, the greater sage grouse, pinyon jays, which I was just reading, it looks like they're gonna declare them an endangered species, declined 98% since 1960s. These are birds that are rapidly declining. And it's the grassland birds, followed by shorebirds, that we're seeing the biggest declines, right? Those are the ones that are really sort of giving us pause. This is the one that really makes me think about this larger landscape and closer to home where we live. Since 1970, so if you aggregated every single bird in North America and you put them in a large pool, we've lost 3 billion individual birds since 1970. And it's accelerating as we speak, right? So that's very disconcerting. And so we've seen roughly about a 30% decline in bird individuals, some species more than others. I don't expect you to know this, but since 1492 and this settlement by non-Europeans after that, we've only lost 9 bird species here in North America. There is the potential by the end of this century to lose over 100 species if, and this is a big word, if things continue on the same track that they're headed, okay? So think about that as we go through here. So let's think a little bit closer to home here, right? Our state bird, all of you know the ruffed grouse is our state bird, right? Everybody's like, of course I know that. Do you know our state insect? Which one, Glenn? The Pennsylvania firefly, which, just a quick tangent, if you know anything about that one, it makes me think, whatever your politics or lack thereof, the Pennsylvania firefly, they call the femme fatale firefly. The female tricks males from other species into coming to mate with them, and then she kills and eats them. So I don't know what those politicians were thinking when they picked that one, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah, let's not go there, right? So our state bird, the ruffed grouse, when I grew up here in Franklin Park, I used to come here Sewickley all the time, even into about the mid-90s was very common. They don't exist here anymore. 28 years ago, you'd find them everywhere. They're no longer here. If you go up to Moraine State Park, where I live today, right on the outskirts, there's none. They are declining rapidly in this state, to the point where we think now, I saw one of the most updated reports from the Game Commission, by 2050, they may be gone completely from the state of Pennsylvania. Very rapid declines. Chimney swifts, one of the birds at Audubon that we focus a lot, you may have seen our swift towers, declined 63%, okay? Rusty blackbirds, 99% since the 1960s. Cerulean warbler, which, believe it or not, Sewickley has a pretty decent population, because I was just down here in April at Sewickley Heights leading a bird walk for one of my classes, which we found them there, but they're also in rapid decline. Golden winged warbler, right? Even birds that were formerly very common even 20 years ago, like wood thrush, or Kentucky warblers, right? Or black and white warblers are in steep decline. American tree sparrows, blackpoll warblers, right? Rapidly declining. So I want you to think about one of the things that the world, whether it's human societies or the natural world, they're always in flux. But there is one common thread behind all of these birds declining, and that is human beings are the cause. We, us, collectively are causing this. So I'm going to give you a quick point to think about here, the passenger pigeon. This is a bird that when Christopher Columbus first settled in the shores of the Caribbean, and then of course, you know, down into the other parts of South America, there was billions in North America. In fact, even up to the American Civil War, their flocks would take 3 days and nights to pass over. They numbered in the billions. By 1914, they were extinct. Now I want you to think about that, right? A bird, we're so used to seeing robins and pigeons or, you know, blackbirds. Imagine that in someone's lifetime, a robin is extinct. That's what it was like when this bird went extinct here. And we do actually have very strong, these are passenger pigeons, so what's called skins. They look like essentially mourning doves, if you're familiar with that bird, but twice the size, much faster flyers. Pigeon shoots, clay pigeons were based on when they used to actually catch and shoot this particular species. All right? But they went from billions to extinct in a short period of time. And it's one of the few times in history that you can actually pinpoint the extinction of a species. And it was September 1st, 1914 at exactly noon in Cincinnati, Ohio. Because the last pair that they had in a zoo was named, not ironically, I guess, George Washington and Martha. George Washington, the male, died in 1911, I think. Martha died exactly around noon on September 1st, 1914. We pinpointed this species going extinct. But there's others. How many of you knew that we used to have a parrot species that we were on the edge of their range, but this species actually once lived when the people that gave Sewickley its name, right, everybody knows that's the Shawnee, I'm sure, right, but Sewickley's a Shawnee's name. When they lived here, these birds could be found in the summertime here, where we're at right now. But they're extinct, okay? So it's a shame that we've lost a lot of these types of birds, and we're facing that. And here's why. Here's the reasons for our decline. Loss of habitat due to deforestation and urban sprawl, right? That is a big one. But it's very complex. It's not as simple as saying, well, yes, they're building new homes or building strip malls, right? Really, truly, and we're starting to wake up to this idea here, is this next one, invasive species, right? How many of you this year or just the last couple of years have started to encounter this spotted lanternfly? Man, are they horrible, aren't they? That will probably be the most destructive invasive insect in North America's agricultural history, right? But there's other ones. It's really the plants that are invading into our areas that still look green, right, that are really the biggest factors. It's not insects. It's plants, invasive plants, and there's a whole host of ones that I could talk. But this is the one that really scares me, the loss of insects. Now, I know when I talk about this, even my own children I talk about, they're like, Dad, please stop talking about why insects are so important to me. That's great. I don't care. They're annoying, right? And I go, well, how many of you, and I do this when I go to elementary schools, and I go, okay, and I say this to my own kids, by show of hands, how many of you here like to eat food? No? Okay, a few of you like to eat food. That's good. Insects are the keystone of our ecosystems, right? The amount of work that they do to provide a lot of the food that we eat is really, really underappreciated. But we are seeing this massive decline of insects. Think in your own lives. When you used to see lightning bugs or fireflies everywhere, or monarch butterflies. I remember playing soccer as a kid in the mid-'80s at Lynbrook Park down on Big Swickley Creek Road, and I was playing goalie, and I still remember my coach going, Chris, stop paying attention to the butterflies and stop the soccer ball going in the net. My dad even said that to me too, right? They've declined 99% in the last 20 years. Very, very sparse this summer, right? That's the big one. Pesticides and herbicides, outdoor cats is another one. Window strikes, and then this last big looming threat, and that's climate change, right? Which we'll talk about. That one, a lot of people get a little, I don't know, Chris, but we'll leave it at that. Deforestation, not just here, but across the world, really. But a lot of our birds that we are encountering here right now travel thousands of miles to a different continent, right? Barn swallows, which you may be familiar with. Hummingbirds, the ruby-throated hummingbird, they go thousands of miles. So they're going through all these different environments that are rapidly changing, right? Urban sprawl, yeah, that'll be good for maybe about 4 different bird species, right? But this is part of the problem. And things like this, right? I am not against grass. I have grass. But it's the extreme. That's a desert biologically, right? This is a crazy thing, again, not touching politics with a 50-foot pole, but this is a lost word we've had here in our society, compromise. Remember compromise? I have grass, but I also have gardens. And my neighbors, who I love dearly, they're good friends of mine, I had an acre of grass that I turned into fruit and vegetable gardens. And they go, Chris, you used to have such a nice lawn. And I go, well, I have vegetables, right? It's this kind of stuff that at this extreme, and it's the extremes that are always the challenge, right? But it's at the extreme that these cause various issues, right? So just to give you an idea, American lawns occupy about 30 million acres of land. Essentially, they account for 17 million gallons of fuel being spilled. But this is the interesting one. This is the biggest one that I essentially want to talk about here is lawns use 10 times the amount of pesticides and fertilizer per acre on their lawns as farmers do on their crops. And that's, they're showing, is where the big impacts on insects are happening, along with these invasive plant species, right? And we don't have issues with water, but again, pesticides. One of the other things I have all sorts of different interests. I'm also an apple farmer. So if you listen to WESA, I think this week I'm going to be interviewed on there about my apple orchard. If you look at my apple orchard, and the reporter came up there, she said, wow, this looks like an overgrown field with trees. And I said, exactly. That's what I'm trying to. Did you ever hear of Kalen's Farm Market? I worked there for 7 years. I was probably the only Pitt student that worked on a farm full-time when I was at Pitt. So I have a lot of various interests, right? Again, balance. I support pollinators, insects, birds, and I produce fruit that I want to make a profit on. I'm not doing this out of the generosity of my heart. I want to make money doing this. So you can find balances between these things. And we're getting there. We're doing these things, right? But here's the really, even worse than that. These are your invasive plants. Garlic mustard, right? Which forms what's called monocultures. Mono meaning one. This is the worst one. Stilt grass, brought over as essentially packing material and porcelain from China. Again, and now it just swamps landscapes. It's like a wildfire of plants because it takes over super, super rapidly. Nothing really eats this. You get 0 insects that will be using this type of stuff. Japanese stilt grass. Yep, but the poor Japanese, actually, it's from China. You get all these things. Japanese knotweed, this Chinese, really, right? They like to pick on Japan for whatever reason. Knotweed. Yeah, well, it's kudzu is our southern friend that is actually now starting to appear here in Pennsylvania. Do you know in the 1930s, kudzu was considered such a great anti-erosion plant, just like this one that was brought in to stop the erosion on our rivers because we cut down all the trees along our riverways, so they were just eroding. So instead of saying, let's plant native trees, what do? We bring in something from a foreign continent that now is destroying huge swaths of our waterways. So in the 1930s in North Carolina and South Carolina, they used to have kudzu queens. Just like there's dairy queens, they would have queens. I have a photograph, my wife is an archivist, from 1933 in North Carolina, the kudzu queen. Now it's like swallowing landscapes. Same thing with this, right? This is one maybe, I'm not going to judge because I remember this too, but I'm our age here a little bit. Do you remember driving, points to your life, and all the insects hitting your windshield? And you having to put on the windshield. I mean, again, in the 90s when I was learning how to drive, and I remember going with my dad and mom, and do you encounter that as often these days? That's that canary telling you that there's something radically changed in our environment that is bad. I'm telling you, even if you don't like mosquitoes, or even if you don't, which I don't, right? Even if you don't care about all the various beetles, we depend on these insects, and so do these birds. This is something that I have really noticed accelerating, and because of these reasons, right? And then I'm going to go through this relatively quickly here because this is hemlock woolly adulgid, another invasive insect killing our state tree, the eastern hemlock, which a lot of these birds depend on, some of them coming thousands of miles. Anybody here a trout fisherman or woman? This is what keeps our streams cold for trout, particularly brook trout. They're dying very rapidly, these hemlocks. Okay, and here's everybody's favorite new invasive species. I was just with my family down at Sandcastle, and in the lazy river, I stopped counting after about 600 of them. They're just, I went to a Pitt football game last year. I will never call it AccuShore. I call it Heinz, and I will always call it Heinz. But they were attacking us as we're going. I mean, this one is really, really bad. It's beautiful, but it is a truly, really bad one. We are not anti-cat, but outdoor cats in North America alone probably kill individually about 1 billion to 2 billion birds every year. Right? Think about that. So a lot of our employees at Audubon have cats. But keeping them indoors is huge for helping birds. And then lastly here, this is one that there are some really, again, scary numbers. Maybe 700 million to 1 billion birds die from window strikes a year. But there is some good news. There's some easy solutions, and believe it or not, PPG is working on glass here in Pittsburgh. That looks completely clear to us, but birds, it absorbs the UV light that to them now appears as a solid object. So whenever there's a challenge, and this is my opening for you all here, this doom and gloom, whenever there's a challenge, there are solutions and opportunities, right? So, yeah, kind of reiterating some of this stuff here. These are all probably highly sort of underestimated. Okay. When you think about the aggregation, there are some poor graduate students, and I say that plural somewhere, that is every year having to go to Windows and going, well, there's one, I got to extrapolate. God bless them, because that is not for me. But yeah, this is some concerning stuff, right? Now, no one should feel guilty about driving cars and hitting birds, because it's just one of those things that happen, right? We've got to come up with a way, though, to mitigate some of these things. And that's not really the main things that really bother me or keep me concerned. It's things like this. Truly, climate change is that big one. Now, again, I'm not going to talk the politics of climate change, but I will tell you this, right? The evidence is so strong that regardless of the cause, right, the birds are really feeling this now. And that's also causing issues with insects. If you remember one thing from this talk, remember December and January and February into the future here. We will have the mildest winter on record this year. And there's evidence-based why that's going to happen. So mark my words, think about that later. These types of things, I'm going to go through this quickly here. I mean, you can see, again, humans are the main driver of this, and it's because of things like us putting literally millions of years of stored carbon, right, into the atmosphere that acts as that heat trapping thing. So I always joke, right? This is, if you grow plants, if you farm, you can see how our hardiness zones are growing. I'm planting apricots and other things in my yard that 20 years ago you could not grow around here because the climate's changing. Now, I always joke, I have interest in birds, right, and history, and even farming and weather, so you could tell I was always asked to all the really happening parties back when I was a teenager, right? You know, everybody wanted me to come. But I study this stuff, because it's, to me, when I see this, it's my job to understand the threat and to communicate it, right? Because these are challenges that we all are going to be impacted, and I have skin in the game. I have children. So you're seeing these are some of, again, I'm not going to really go into the detail of this, but we're faced at this crossroads now. We've already seen the shift, and if we continue on the path we're at now, by the end of this century, our climate's going to be what you see in northern Alabama. So, all right, I'm going to go through this quickly here, because I don't want to belabor the point here. I'm going to get into some of the positive things here. So, one of the things at Audubon that I do is, how many of you have ever heard of what's called the Christmas bird count? Has anybody ever heard of the Christmas bird count? A few of you, right? It is the longest running community science program going back to 1900. Right? In fact, believe it or not, one of the earliest ones was right here in Sewickley. Sewickley has a tie-in to that. I have data from 1904 from here in Sewickley of birds they were counting. And it's actually amusing to read, because they were super excited to get things like robins and cardinals, because they weren't common, right? And what the Christmas bird, it's not on Christmas. Everybody thinks, oh, you give up Christmas to count birds. No, it started that way, but it's a 3-week period. You pick one day, you count birds in a particular circle, and it gives scientists this running database to look at what bird populations are doing, right? And they're seeing these massive shifts in population. Again, one of them is robins. Do you remember 30 years ago, robins weren't super common in our winters. Now they're everywhere here, okay? So that's part of it. So we're seeing these big shifts. Here, there's two birds that have now become resident here in Sewickley that have the name Carolina in it. Carolina wrens and Carolina chickadees. Now, they didn't name them Carolinas because they were found here in western Pennsylvania, right? They've extended their range at the expense of other species, and that's climate change, okay? However, What this report showed that out of 604 bird species that they modeled, and there's over 800 in North America, 389 are vulnerable to extinction, okay, because of just climate change alone. Right? And so as soon as 2080, more than half of their current range would become inhospitable and they wouldn't gain new ground because of climate change. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, we are going to have a desert here in Western PA. That means the food resources that they depend on, like those insects, evolved in a really narrow type of area that they could live in, right? And so when that food goes away, those birds will start declining, which we're seeing, which is that canary, right? So all of these things that we're talking about, and think about that, with all the changes that we've done here in our landscape since 1492, we've only lost 9, and every one we should never have lost, but we've only lost 9. And there's now 140 species that are considered climate endangered that potentially could go extinct by the end of this century, just because of climate change. Most of them are in the grasslands, but there are some around here, okay? So, again, I put this in here just to reiterate this. So, and again, even birds that you are probably still considering plentiful, when you aggregate robins and cardinals and a number of other common species, they too are declining, right? Does anybody here feed birds by chance? Have bird feeders? A few of you here. Do you remember 2 years ago when the state recommended we take down our feeders because there was this mortality event, right? In some places, thankfully it was never found here in Western PA. It's an interesting mystery because we still don't have 100% idea of what caused it. It was probably more than one thing, but it was very closely tied to one of those cicada, 17-year cycle cicadas, right? But in some places, robins and cardinals and blue jays completely disappeared where that was going on. All right, so it can happen very, very rapidly. This bird, you have a lot of, I love this bird for a number of reasons. This is chimney swifts. So a lot of people confuse them. They have them in their chimneys. They think they're bats, right? They make a really tiny nest. They eat about 4,000 to 5,000 mosquito-sized insects a day. Yes, they're voracious feeders. And one of the birds, Glenn, you may have read about this now, but I'm not sure, that they're pretty sure that they find that these birds sleep while they fly in the air. Some birds do that. Albatross cannot touch ground for sometimes 13 months, and they sleep while they're flying. They think these birds do that too. So even if you don't like looking at all these birds, there's all these really cool stories that go, and this is one that is still common here in Western PA. I guarantee every one of you will have one of these birds around you today, wherever you are here in this particular part of Western PA. And that's because the types of insects that they eat, generally speaking, are still relatively abundant, but that's not everywhere across their range. I like how Peterson describes them. Roger Tory Peterson, one of the first guys, he describes them as stogies with wings, right? Yes, and they look like big fat cigars with wings, right? This bird goes down to the Amazon in the winter. You know what it does down there? We have no idea. If you want to fund me in an expedition, actually, it's funny I mentioned that. My brother-in-law's Peruvian. They go to Peru, and I asked them about where they found it, because for over 20 years, 100 years ago or plus, they would band these birds with aluminum bands. They knew they left North America, but they didn't know where they went until right at the end of World War II. There was a Christian missionary that went out to an uncontacted peoples in a tributary of the Amazon, and he found them wearing these necklaces with all these aluminum bands. They were eating them. That's about the only clue that we have where they go. What they do in winter, we still have no idea. And the theories is they go up into the clouds, eat insects, and they sleep for weeks on end, right? So I asked my brother-in-law, who's from Peru, I said, do you know about this place? He goes, yeah, no one goes there. It's very dangerous. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's cool, though, that these birds are connecting us to places that probably most of us, unless you want to go to some remote part of Peru, are never going to go, right? But this is one, and really, they can't perch. They have to hang on a vertical surface. right? And I'm going to go to, there's a bird rehabber that we work with. Sometimes the young ones fall down chimneys and they rehab and release them. They land on you and they look like little puppies. They got these like little puppy dog eyes that look at you, right? So if you see these things around here in Allegheny County, these are giant birdhouses for chimney swifts. We make them all fancy because we get grants and it helps educate people, but that's what this is. And I'm happy to say we've, in a very short period of time, 10 years, have actually reduced their decline in Western PA because of this, right? It doesn't take much to change some of these things. And again, I don't know about you, but I'm not a fan of getting bit by mosquitoes. Just like bats, they eat tons of mosquitoes, right? So really, really cool bird. So just to reiterate though, in other parts of their land, particularly in Canada, they've just declared them their version of endangered. So they've declined in some parts of Ontario and Quebec about 90%. And I think a lot of that has to do with how Canada was managing some of their landscapes. Canada has a lot of spruce that they use for lumber and also for paper, and they would mass spray with herbicides to stop certain insects, and they think that was having a major impact. Here's, and again, my family used to hunt these species, ruffed grouse. You can see why it's called a ruffed. Looks like they've got the ruffles, ruffled collar. In the larger chicken family, like I said, not that long ago in Franklin Park, I can remember hearing them drumming. So they make like a sonic boom, the males do, with their wings. Man, all the things that us guys do to get those ladies' attentions, right? I had a peacock show up at Beechwood yesterday. Yeah, just outside my window, someone randomly lets a peacock roam around. And I was thinking about that, looking at that poor bird's like super long tail going, man, the things us guys do to get those ladies' attention. So I gotta call home to my wife and she's, yeah. Anyways. Has anybody seen a ruffed grouse? Anybody here ever hunt ruffed grouse? Yeah. My family, my mom's side of the family is from up near State College. So ruffed grouse hunting was a big thing. And where my mom's family's from up near Penn State, there's 0 ruffed grouse. Completely gone. Blackman Shannon State Park. It's right where they live by.
Now, is an effort being made to repopulate ruffed grouse?
Yes.
Audubon Society associated with that?
Yes, but I'm going to tell you why that is failing, and the Game Commission is kind of freaking out about it. Okay? Yes, in fact, even where I live in Moraine State Park, part of the problem is lack of habitat. So, and that means as forests grow, so we have a lot of forests that they're the same age, these birds need relatively younger forest. So they started managing cutting areas and leaving the trees lay for younger forests. And the ruffed grouse aren't coming back. So what they finally discovered, I'm just going to show you one more picture because I'm a bird nerd and I like looking at pictures here. Look at that one. They come in both red and gray with the black ruffles. This is the one doing the sonic boom. And you could hear, you could, whoa. I'm not going to do it because it's not going to sound great over the microphone, but I mean, it literally makes a sonic boom, right? I can remember it right off of Nicholson Road, where the farm of Caitlin's used to have, right? You would hear it in April and May. It is a really, really sad thing to happen here. And so we could see Pennsylvania, all of these things, 2017, they haven't updated it. COVID kind of hit it, but actually we think 2020 was worse than 2019. 2021 was even worse. It's going rapidly down. I read things this last year was due, I think now they've declined 89% since the year 2000. Remember Y2K? That doesn't seem like that long ago for me. 89% since then. Okay? It's not due to hunting. In fact, if anything, hunting, right? I'm just going to go through rapidly here because I'm running out of time, and I don't want to get my old college professor hat on and I'd be great in a filibuster, by the way, but yeah, a lot of it is these things. All of these things are important, but they've realized even when they change the habitat, that's not what the problem is. It's this. West Nile. How many of you have heard of West Nile? So starting in the late 90s, unintentionally through our global trade, we brought in an invasive mosquito species from Egypt, that's where it originated from, that carries and harbors West Nile virus. I'll bet you every person in this room has been bit by this mosquito and have the antibodies in you. It's super common now. When it originally hit in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was highly deadly to the corvid family, which are crows, ravens, blue jays. And I did a study as a non-scientist, but helping them count this. They got over it pretty quickly. But for some reason, as was just discovered recently, ruffed grouse are not. And this is one of the bad news ones, that there doesn't seem to be anything we can do. You hope that some of the few that have shown a little bit of innate resistance could eventually, over time, get their populations back up. But there's other things like habitat loss, like climate change, that are also working against this bird. So all of those things. So, and now the other bird that they just changed the species, but they used to be called the northern goshawk, which you can go up in the northern part of Pennsylvania and see. They too have shown they're declining because of West Nile. So it's unintentional things like that, okay? So we're gonna have to think here. This is the climate change on top of the West Nile by the end of this century. We need a new state bird, because they'll be gone out of our state, right? So that's bad news, right? So a lot of people leave it at that, but I'm not, because I've got good news for you. As bad as all that sounds, believe it or not, there is hope. Truly. So as a historian, and this is where I do my, and use a bad pun, cross-pollination, the future's not written, right? The past is, we live in the present, but we can make simple changes, believe it or not, to change the trajectory of these birds. I've got children. I got a 15-year-old and 10-year-old. Good Lord, no one ever told me the challenges of teenagers, but, right? There is hope. And I want you to think about this, why? I mentioned bald eagles, right? We'll talk about this. Does anybody remember the 1960s? Some of you maybe don't remember the 1960s, but I'll leave it at that, right? Did you know in 1963, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, while they around that era and JFK's assassination, that bald eagles were on the path of extinction? There was 400 pairs left in lower 48, and scientists at that time predicted that at that rate, by 1980, they would be completely extinct in the lower 48. And today, they are like pigeons. We joke in the bird world, and Glenn's, I'm sure, heard me say this a bazillion times, oh, that's another boring bald eagle. Let's find something more exciting. Now think about that, right? Our national bird almost went extinct, and now they're super common here where my family worked in those mills. It doesn't take a lot. And they're not the only ones. Peregrine falcons, the fastest animal in the world, brown pelicans, osprey, they've all come back, right? And simple changes that we've done. All of these are things, right? Again, you don't have to get rid of the lawn. I have plenty. Everybody's like, oh, Chris, you hate grass. I really don't. I have tons of grass. My son's a soccer player. We play soccer in it. But even having a vegetable garden, believe it or not, even if you don't want all the native plants, a vegetable garden helps insects and pollinators, right? We do, if you really want to get involved in this, we have a certified backyard program that we come out, give you assess, we ask you what you want to do, we give you advice, you can do it, don't do it. We now have done enough of these in the last 5 years that we've essentially created multiple nature reserves across Western PA. And we show scientifically there's evidence that these yards have more lightning bugs and insects than birds. There's more birds, all of these things, right? So there's some simple, keep your cats indoors. It's better for them, right? They're not going to get run over or hurt. Remove invasive species if you really want to get involved. The Allegheny Land Trust is nearby here. There's all sorts of things you could do. So one of the things that the bald eagle really inspires me, it's the symbol of the United States, right? Which I love this story with Benjamin Franklin you're familiar with. He didn't want the bald eagle to be their national bird. Anybody ever hear that story? Did you know he was joking when he said that, by the way? That was a joke that he was right. You know, he was joking. That's what this is a lost art. This is no judgment on anybody on our age here, because I remember doing this too, but you tell young people this. One time, we used to do this thing called write letters. We would write on a piece of paper and then put it in the mail. I tell my kids or young people this, they're like, wait, you used to write down stuff on paper and put it out in the mailbox? I say, yeah, even I did that, right? Benjamin Franklin was joking with his daughter. He was being sarcastic, right? There's a good historical reason, which if you want to know later, you can ask me. But this bird to me signifies not only our country and our strength, but our resilience. Resilience as a country, but resilience in the fact that when these things that we're seeing in our environment go bad, we can turn them around if we have the will and the want. Right? Yes, sir. When we moved there, it was orange. From my yeah. And eventually got cleared up, and the kids skate there and play hockey and whatnot. And every spring, we get these geese that come from somewhere. We used to be Canada. And it's gotten to the point now where sometimes we gotta have to stop on the street and wait while they waddle their way up and down. Yeah. And just 2 weeks ago, we went over to my daughter's in Collier. They were over there. I thought, well, maybe they're taking them on training flights. Yeah, right. They do, yeah. Yeah, they're everywhere. And the lake is, fortunately, I don't know whether it cleared itself out or whatever. I don't remember any major project. It's a combination of, sometimes a lot of that acid mine drainage, especially around here, is because of projects that you can't see. And believe it or not, there's a lot of native plants that actually act as filters, things like cattails and stuff like that. So, yes, sir.
You put up the factors. You guys estimate how many birds are killed by wind turbines?
Yes, absolutely. No. That's and I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of my background. And one of the various things that I've done. I used to work in wind power when I got out of Pitt. And yes, wind turbines do kill birds. There's no doubt about that, right? And it is complicated because it depends on the species and where, and this is the most important thing, where you site the wind turbines. Has anybody ever heard of Altamont Pass in California where they built those ones? Yes, they built hundreds of them right smack dab in the biggest migratory path of a lot of birds. Dumbest idea. But again, the road to hell was paved with good intentions. No one knew. Pennsylvania, similar things in the early ones. Now it takes into account when you're citing those things of what birds and bird species. I'm going to Hawk Mountain out east where thousands of broadwing hawks migrate through. And they've had to move some of these wind turbines as a result, but they're still what's called bycatch. They kill birds. But I will tell you, it is still substantially less than cars hitting birds, which we're never going to get rid of cars, right? Windows, outdoor cats. And believe it or not, a lot of the discharge from coal power plants still causes more death to birds and wind turbines. You just can't see it, right? So yeah, everything we do in a landscape scale is going to impact birds, and it does kill birds, there's no doubt. My last slide here, I promise, and I'll leave it open to here because I've gone a few minutes over here. So this is my last picture, and I've got a quote that I'll read. It takes 10 seconds. all of this is essentially is that we're all interconnected, the web of life, right? But you don't know when you're pulling on like a spider web. If you pull on the wrong strand, the whole thing might come down. And that's essentially what these birds as the canaries are telling us. So a good Pittsburgher here that I am very influenced by, you may have heard of Rachel Carson, who went to Chatham University. She has this quote, and this is from Silent Spring. And she says, man's attitude toward nature is today critically important simply because we have now acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man is a part of nature, and his or our war against nature is inevitably a war against ourselves. We are challenged as humankind has never been challenged before to prove our maturity and mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. So that's to me what it is because we are part of nature. And these future generations, my kids, maybe you have grandkids, they're going to be the ones that inherit this challenge, right? But, and I'll leave it open to questions now if we have the time, because I know I've gone over a few minutes here, that we can change this because we've done it.
You know, one thing I've noticed is I tried feeding the birds. Mm-hmm. All right, so you know who I feed? Chipmunks, squirrels, and at night all the deer come in and clean up whatever the birds don't get.
Yep.
And I just feel like I'm just wasting money.
Well,
they're not eating it.
Can I give you a dirty secret here? I shouldn't be telling you this because my salary is funded by birdseed sales. So hopefully my boss or the store manager is not listening to this somewhere here. Easiest thing to do instead of feeding them seeds is plant native plants. Because, yes, that is going to be way more impactful than getting birdseed. Right? Most of the birdseed they put in there is filler anyways that most birds aren't going to eat. Shh, I should have told you that. But yeah, native plants by far. And there are ones, I know this is going to shock you, that deer will never eat because they can't. It'll kill them if they eat them. So yeah, I know it's frustrating. I stopped feeding birds with birdseed because I have bears. I don't want giant bears smashing down my feeders where I live. So, native plants.
The connection between West Nile and grouse was made by the Game Commission, who had quite a bit of funds because hunting is so important to most Pennsylvanians. Have studies been done on all these other declines of birds to see if it's viruses?
Yeah, and that's the thing, and I want to get this point big time. Hunting is not causing your decline. The biggest conservationists that help ducks return to, in fact, more ducks than probably in the last 200 years is Wild Ducks Unlimited, duck hunters. So grouse hunters want to help, and yes, the Game Commission found that. It has been found some species like the northern goshawk, now the American goshawk, West Nile was doing that. But most of these other species that are insect specialists, like these warblers and all these other species, the studies have shown it's because this rapid decline of insects has been the main thing. It's not virus, and they don't seem to be impacted the same way that these other ones are. Yes, sir.
My question is, you talked about the United States, but how about the rest of the world? Are they doing anything? The reason I ask, I have an acquaintance, he goes to Mexico with a whole crew of guys, and they go dove hunting, and each one of them kills like 2,000 doves, and they give it to the local populace. What's the rest of the world doing?
No, that is a really good question, because birds don't, when a lot of our birds are migrating, they don't stop at the border of Mexico and check their passport in. Right? Yeah, I mean, that is a major issue. Now, I will tell you, with game birds, though, even in Mexico, in a lot of areas, there are some regulations, right? But as we all know, you can have the best regulations. People still around here, believe it or not, kill bald eagles. There's always going to be that dumb person that takes a pot shot at a bald eagle or a hawk, right? And in places like Mexico, or even worse in Central America, places like Nicaragua, they still will take a lot of these endangered parrots and sell them in the bird trade. So if we get rid of the demand of that, that's a big part of it. But I was just in Costa Rica. Has anybody here ever been to Costa Rica? Costa Rica is the poster child in how to get changes that are positive. And again, I am a total capitalist. I believe in making money. There's that. I'm not doing this. Everybody thinks I do work for a nonprofit, but that doesn't mean I'm not getting paid because I got bills to make, right? Costa Rica now, their entire economy is based essentially on ecotourism. And they've reduced, I got to see a parrot in the wild. I've always wanted to see the great green parrot, which was almost extinct because of the wildlife trade, but now, I mean, they're really rapidly coming back. So there's a thing called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that the United States, Mexico, and Canada signed over 100 years ago that regulates some of this. And yeah, I mean, it's not perfect, but yes, there is definitely some things, but there's always going to be local challenges, right? Other parts of the world, it's not so great, right? Some parts of Europe, some parts of Africa and Asia, they don't seem to care quite as much. I live here, so this is what I can do for us, but it's getting the awareness out there. But yeah, I mean, these are certainly challenges, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Question, we plant flowers, we can't garden anymore. Just can't do it. Are there special flowers that you would suggest planting to feed the birds?
Yeah,
Here locally.
Yeah, absolutely. Has anybody been driving around, or maybe you've noticed in the past right now, and there's this bright pink flower that grows along the roads? I mean, sometimes it's huge. It's beautiful, big pink flower. It's called Joe Pye wheat. It's a native plant that is one of the best plants you can plant for pollinators, insects, butterflies, and birds. And you know what I do how I maintain it? I don't. Because it's native. You don't have to baby it. It grows. And people go, well, these are weeds. Well, a rose can be a weed if you don't want it.
Seeds?
Yeah.
Every year
it self-seeds, but it does. It's a perennial, and the roots stay, but it will self-seed to the point where I also grow different types of goldenrods. I have to remove it because it starts to take over. That's what's great about our native plant species. They're native to here. So they just do what you do, and I just watch them and watch the birds use them, right?
Sunflower.
Yeah, that's a native. There's all sorts of sunflowers, absolutely. Yeah, big sunflowers, but those are the ones from central United States, but they're great too. Yeah, absolutely. They do, right? If you don't want it, it'll be a weed. That's what I always say, right? Roses can be a weed if you don't want it. Yes, sir.
Are new species of birds appearing regularly, and how are they created?
Boy, that is a very interesting question. Are new bird species appearing? Yes, but not for the reason you may think. So some people, Glenn, do you have a life list? So life list, if you're not familiar, a lot of birders keep a list of every single bird that they've ever seen. And they get excited. They go, yes, I've seen, I'm just going to use an arbitrary number, 600 bird species. And then next year, that list goes down to 597 because some scientist looks at the DNA and taxonomy and goes, you know what, that's no longer a species. So I'm going to make them combined into one. Speciation and what we consider species in science right now, we're starting to rapidly come to the realization doesn't really exist. So that's why I say it's an interesting question, because there's all sorts of bird species that they're going, it's probably not really a species. Evolution and natural selection, yeah, we see some changes, but very slowly to the point where I wouldn't necessarily what we consider species, but they are finding new bird, quote unquote, and I'll use that again, species all the time. Did you know there's poisonous birds? There's birds in New Guinea that they've just found that their feathers are poisonous because the ornithologists that caught these ones started to get sick after they handled them. They had not been described to science before. So they're finding new species all the time.
Hey, Chris, a lot of people are getting into beekeeping and so forth. I know there's declining bee populations too. How does that play in with the birds? Does that help, hinder? what?
Yeah, and remember, so when you're keeping bees, like honeybees are not native to North America. They're originally from Europe and Asia and Africa, right? So they've already got some challenges to begin with, just not being native. Our milkweeds trap them. My kids and I are the bee rescuers with our milkweeds. Bumblebees, which are native, love them, right? But that is definitely declining. And so here's the thing, if you notice lots of bees around your yard, it's because you've got flowers. Or you don't cut your grass every week. I cut my grass every other week, sometimes every 3 weeks in the spring, because the bees, honeybees that people nearby me that have them, the bears, like, Yogi Bear likes to raid theirs. They've got to put an electric fence around it now. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, all of the bees come to my yard because I've got flowers, which tells me then there's lots of other insects that I see these birds stopping and eating them. So all of those things work together, right? Go ahead, Glenn. Yep.
Two things. First, if you're going to plant, Joe Biden, don't plant it in front of your picture window at Princeton.
Yes, it's a very big, tall growing plant. Yes.
We'll scatter about.
There you go.
Secondly, I really want to get you started, but are you among the 9 that went extinct? Are you counting ivory-billed woodpeckers or not?
Yes, he did. Have you heard that, the ivory-billed woodpecker? It's like this. I'm telling you, I'm gonna pitch a new TV series to Hollywood called Bird CSI. You familiar with CSI, the TV show? I get calls at Audubon all the time. Chris, I found this feather in feathers underneath my bird feeder. What happened? And then I hear the sound, dun, 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 and I come out and I'm looking at the bird, and they're like, yeah. There was a crime here. Ivory-billed woodpeckers, I'll leave it at this, Glenn, they're extinct. That's how I feel. There's a lot of what the younger kids say. It's funny when I start to feel old and then my kids are teaching me all this slang. The kids call that hopium. Hopium. Yes. So yeah, I think that bird's extinct. But people disagree very strongly with me on that. So.
Bird CSI starring Chris Kubiak.
That's right.
A Quinn Martin production.
I want to have some good-looking, famous Hollywood actor play me, though. So that's the only thing I want out of that. So.
Chris, this is a bit specific.
Sure.
But, we watched the Hayes bald eagle's nest.
Yeah.
And so we're now wondering, do the young ever come back? Do the father's been coming back, check out the nest and so forth, but we don't seem to see the mother.
Yep.
Do they ever reunite at any point? Do they keep contact with each other, the family?
That is a great question. So if you heard that, right? And what was that song? Papa was a Rolling Stone. The young wander widely. It's like in the 1960s on that motorcycle. They're just going off touring across the United States. No, unfortunately, they don't. The young, so when they started to bring bald eagles back to Pennsylvania, they would trap young birds from Saskatchewan and brought them back, hoping to repopulate them here in Pennsylvania. They realized as soon as they let them go, they started finding them in New York, South Carolina, Michigan, Florida. The young wander wildly, and once after they fledge, about 6 to 8 weeks afterwards, the parents' hormones wear off, and they view them as basically interlopers. So now that my kids are going to be 18 here in a few years, maybe I need to start thinking about this too, right? Hey, it's time for you to move on, right? No, they don't. The questions I get, I've had people ask me, they love those cameras. My mom, even during COVID, watched it, and she's like, have you heard about this Eagle camera? And I go, Mom, where have you been the last 8 years? I've been working at Audubon, right?
I love that camera when I think it was a raccoon got in there, and that female bald eagle tore that raccoon a new one. I mean, she was ferocious.
That was almost the last thing that raccoon ever did. Yeah.
Anybody else? We're kind of over our time here.
I'm sorry, I talk way too much.
No, that's
I
fine.
apologize.
That's fine. Anybody got any real quick questions?
Yeah, that is a really, honestly, it's a complex story. If you ever want to have me come back, I've got a whole program on it. But it used to be think it was all human beings that did it, and now there's strong evidence that it wasn't just human beings. It was a natural cycle that we really started to really persecute them, hunt them, go after them when they were on one of their down cycles, which caused it really rapid. But if you want me back in the future, I can certainly
We'll
talk
have
about
you
that.
back. Hey,
That's
if
my teaser.
Anybody interested, right close by, up on Big Sewickley Creek Road, just, you know where the wine cement plant is and the wine products plant? There's a blue heron?
Yes,
Blue
rookery.
heron rookery. When I first noticed it, there was one tree with maybe about 6 or 8 nests. Now they're up to 3 trees, and there must be 40 or 50 of these birds. Best time to see them is just in the springtime before the trees leaf out. You'll see hundreds of them sitting on those trees. Pretty cool.
Yep.
Pretty cool. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Very, very interesting.